titled Learning to Lead, will address the capacities that scientists need tomorrow. I will call upon the following two individuals to come up on stage. First, moderator, Dr. Katrin Rehak-Nitsche, Senior Vice President, Science and Research at Robert Bosch Stiftung. Dr. Katrin, please take a seat. To deliver his opening remarks, I will call upon Professor Jean-Pierre Bourguignon, President at the European Research Council, to come up and deliver his speech. Thank you, sir. Welcome.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, it's a great pleasure for me to be here and to be given the possibility of addressing you on this topic of building leadership or learning to lead. So it has been a great adventure to follow Ames first as a mathematician, but then later on also the birth of the next Einstein Forum. The first thing I want to say before I go into my topic is really give you a warning. That is, there are so many different ways of doing research, and there are so many different environments that one has to be very careful in not giving universal advices, because there are really different situations and different ways of doing research. Sometimes individuals can make a difference. Sometimes you really need really extensive teams, and these teams can be really delocalized. So this makes a huge difference. Now, concerning the topic, during this conference, we have been hearing quite a number of very interesting contributions on, for example, the need to have really the next generation or the young generation really empowered. And actually, so this is really the point where the question of building the leadership capacity comes in, because they are really the people who should be accompanied in the right way. And of course, we heard many experiences, and I'll just mention in passing one of my experience on this. Unfortunately, if you look worldwide concerning the way young people are considered, I must say that if I compare my own situation, I'm now reasonably old, really what was offered to younger people at my time, which I would say in the early 70s, was definitely much more favorable for younger people than today. I say this very sadly because I think it's really a wrong situation, in particular because young researchers have to prove themselves much more, and they have to wait a much longer time to get really a decent job. And I'm not sure this is good for research, and I'm sure it definitely has a negative effect on a number of researchers who don't see really any career paths ahead of them, and really distracts them from what I was. So just to give one example of my own career, I was extremely privileged to be offered the position at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, CNRS. I was just 21. And of course, with this possibility, I could really look at hard problems, not really threatening my family, because I was actually already married at that time, and very soon a father, and therefore it was very important that I had this possibility of sustaining myself. So to be constructive about these opening remarks, I would like to divide the points I would like to raise in two categories. There are some which have to do with institutions, which really have to do something right for really making it possible for young people to lead. But also there are some things which have to do with people. And we have heard repeatedly how much people make a difference for research altogether. So I think the young researchers have to really keep a number of things in mind, and of course, in particular, in the way they think about their own itinerary. Concerning institutions, I think it's very important that during the learning periods, of course, institutions have to be extremely strict on the standards they use to deliver diplomas and various qualifications. And this is certainly something on which a compromise would be a mistake. So this is the first thing. If you want to have leaders, people have to know that they have been really properly qualified and certified. So this is something on which institutions should not compromise. But at the same time, they should offer a really broad mentoring, and one should, I think quite often, this is a difficulty, that is the dependence of young researchers from one single person who is their advisors. I understand that's sometimes difficult to avoid that, but I think it would be very important for me to build leadership, that people can really take some distance from the people with whom they are working. I know it's sometimes delicate because it hurts some traditions or some cultures, but I think this is an element which I wanted to bring forward. The other thing is that in a given place, the people who are being trained, they form a category who should really have some solidarity in the sense of sharing their own experiences, explaining to each other what they are doing, because I think this communication between trainees is extremely important. First, to learn how to communicate with others, but also to really accept the challenges from people from their own generation, which I think is much easier to accept than challenges from elder people. So I think being challenged by your peers, that is, people of the same age as you, is something very important. The next point has to do, after you have gotten a PhD, it's a very critical moment because actually very often people look for moving from the place where they have been, and I think it's a very healthy situation to be exposed to other environments. But I think very often what is offered to people are extremely short periods, typically 1 year postdoctoral fellowships, sometimes 2 years. And I think this is such a critical moment where people can start to have their own ideas to really gain some independence, that I would really advise institutions, when they offer this kind of postdoctoral fellowships, to offer them long enough that people really can, first of all, develop good quality research, and also don't have immediately after they take such a position to think of the next one, which of course occupy completely their mind, and of course lead them to try to publish as much as they can extremely quickly, and of course not something of too much substance because they don't have the time to build something very successful. And I think it's also very important because then it leaves time for people to really develop a personal research strategy. And this kind of a first step of independence is quite important. And for institutions, I know because I've been confronted in my own country, which has a good tradition of rigidity. I'm Frenchman. I'm sure you have detected that for some time, that actually it's extremely important that actually institutions show some flexibility. Flexibility at this stage is extremely important for people to be able to realize their promises. Now I'm coming to people, and I'm really meaning around researchers, the people who really have to become leaders. I think the very first element I want to point to is the fact that it's very critical that they try and build their own project. It's sometimes difficult. Again, it has a lot to do with in which kind of research you are doing. Sometimes you're really in a team of 1,000 people, so of course having your own project is quite difficult. But still, I think you have to try and come up with your own vision. And actually for such a purpose, I think it's very important that early enough you imagine what would be for you the ideal trajectory. I must say that among the ERC grantees, European Research Council people that we support, some of them really are amazing in the way they have built an itinerary for themselves, and which sometimes was not so easy to come up with, but they really had a vision where they wanted to go. And from that point of view, what makes it easier for you to make this itinerary a reality is, of course, that you should build your own network. And of course, you will a lot depend on the network of people who train you, people who have accepted you as postdocs and so on. Of course, this is very good because you are becoming an identity in a sector. But I think starting to have your own, the people with whom you relate on a personal basis is very important. And of course, at this stage, it's a moment where you have to be recognized as an expert in a certain field. But be careful, because you could be trapped in this very narrow field. So I think in order to be a leader, at some point you have to expose yourself to contacts outside your own domain of expertise. And actually, this will lead to have your curiosity really excited, and also to prepare yourself for comments on possible criticism from people from outside. So I think being willing and being eager to get really a broader view of the science in which you are embedded, or even some kind of sciences which are quite different from yours. And therefore, I think from that point of view, it's connected to what I said about these postdoctoral fellowships, which would be important to take outside your own institution. I think early in the career, having the possibility of visiting other institutions can be really extremely important. As for myself, for example, I all of a sudden got an offer to visit a university from one day to the next because somebody listened to a lecture I gave and offered me a job the next day in an American university. I never thought about really going to America so early after I didn't have a PhD at that time, but I had already publications. Actually changed my life because the environment I was exposed to changed completely the view I had of my own work. So I think changing your environment can actually be extremely fruitful. Almost to conclude, if you allow me to take this opportunity to mention just a few things about the European Research Council, ERC, which I'm very honored to preside upon. I think ERC does respect a number of the principles I've called your attention to. Namely, we give full initiative to researchers. We want them really to propose their most ambitious project, high risk again, as we call them. 2/3 of the contract we give are given to scientists under 40 years of age, and it's a substantial number. Last year we gave for the first time more than 1,000 contracts, so it means more than 700 people were younger. Also, we try to be as flexible as possible. We gave 5-year contracts, which means that people can, in the middle, change a bit their strategy because they realize that the strategy they proposed was not ideal and they see a better strategy to follow. And also, we are quite tough on institutions. That is, we force the institution to recognize the rights of researchers. And in particular, this has to do with the intellectual property rights. So if a host institution accepts an ERC grant, they have to guarantee that the grantee is going to take advantage of the IP rights in a good proportion with the institution. So just my final words is that the issue to empower the next generation is absolutely critical for the success, which means that we have to accompany young people to become leaders. And it must be addressed through both structural measures, but also on the side of the young people, an increased self-confidence in their capacity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Is the microphone on? Jean-Pierre Bourguignon. May I now invite the panelists to please join me on stage. First, the Honorable Minister of Science and Technology in South Africa, Kubayi-Ngubane. Please. Welcome. Then, Tom Kariuki. He's Director of the Alliance for Accelerating Excellence in Science, launched by the African Academy of Sciences, and by training, he's an immunologist. Welcome. I also invite Tumani Corrah. He's the Director of the African Research Excellence Fund and former Director of the MRC unit in the Gambia and a medical researcher. Welcome on stage. And I invite Connie Nshemereirwe. She's an independent researcher and educator and involved in the African Science Leadership Program and the Global Young Academy. And last but not at all least, I invite Howard Alper. He's the chair of the Global Excellence Initiative Canada and board member of the Next Einstein Initiative and a chemist by training. Excellencies, distinguished guests, also from my side, a very warm welcome to the late session today. We are lucky to be gathered here today with such different backgrounds, and all what we share is the commitment for training the next generation of researchers. Why is this important? There are two things actually. So at the moment, as you all know, African scientists have a share of 1 to 2% of the world researchers and publications. But also, as we know, the enrollment rates during the last 10 to 15 years more than doubled. And Africa has not only the youngest population, but is also going to have the biggest, largest population in the entire world. And this means there's a large number of potential researchers, actually. The second point is that we are facing severe problems, be it urbanization, climate change, digital revolution, and a changing world order. And at the heart of all these developments are the sciences and the humanities. They help us to understand these things, to classify and to address these issues. And given the number of people and potential and the complexity of these wicked problems, Africa, and by the way also the rest of the world, will need inspiring young leaders that catalyze transformation and that manage change. And that's what we are here for, and here at the next Einstein Forum to discuss how to get there. What support do young researchers need on their way to leadership, and what skills do they actually need? And let me start with a short tour of short Q&A, and allow me to begin with you, Honorable Minister. From your perspective as Minister of Science and Technology, do you think governments are supporting young scientists enough on their way to leadership, and what could possibly be improved?
Thank you very much. I think definitely there's a lot of work. There is support, but there's still a lot of work to be done. There is support in a sense that if you look at a number of areas that have been developed, I mean, a case and example where we are, we have a president who has taken keen in terms of driving from a leadership point of view, the support and the initiatives. Now you go to various countries, you'll find initiatives, the work that is being done around mentoring, around providing funding for young people who want to remain in the field, not only for junior degrees, but also for postgraduate qualifications. So that support is there. I mean, we can make an example from South Africa. We do provide support for young people who are interested in studying in the science field, what we call the STEM studies, from as early as being in high school. Providing that support in terms of support for the teachers as well, so that they can be able to give quality teaching around the areas. But I think there is a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of setting up mechanisms to provide more support. I mean, I've had an example where somebody says, Minister, even the team that I was meeting this morning was saying, Minister, yes, there is funding that is being given to a research project and work that is being done. But there are more issues that young people face. For example, children who are coming from poor backgrounds, who have to worry about where they stay, what they eat, what they wear, but equally important as well, some of them have to worry about what their families are eating. So in order for us to sustain them in universities, in order for us to continue to encourage them to stay and do your PhDs, where we can be able to see some of these innovative ways coming through from these young people, we have to think about a broader way, a mechanism to respond to their environment. So I think there's more work that we can be able to do. We have done some of the programs that we support in young people at South Africa. As I said, the issues of PhDs, the issues of funding, providing them, linking them to universities, but also programs that are specifically meant for young people, but mentoring in the process and coaching for them. So that is important for us to be able to bring a holistic approach so that they are able to stay in studies, but equally within the critical areas.
Thank you very much. Tom Kariuki, at the African Academy of Sciences, among others, you are responsible for the Deltas program, qualification programs for scientific leaders, and hopefully with a large proportion of women. Do you think women have a special role when it comes to transformation and changing environment in science?
I'm not sure that question is because I'm a father of daughters or because because I lead big programs at the Academy that has. We've made a very deliberate effort to actually put this issue front and center in terms of how we actually are engaging African, scientists across the continent. But I think, more generally speaking, I think, when we define leadership and we want to ask questions around what should a good leader or what skills should a good leader have, man or woman, I guess there are things that then come to the fore around, how we want this to proceed. So we want to have good collaborations. A leader should be somebody who engenders very good collaborations and equal partnerships. And I don't know whether there have been any studies that anybody has done to show whether actually women do a better job of collaborations and equal partnerships than men. I suppose there could be data along those lines. We want a leader to have ethical behavior. And ethical behavior is about you as a leader, practicing ethical behavior, but also imparting ethical behavior. And I guess, again, there are issues around, for example, plagiarism in the scientific world, or research misconduct in the scientific world. And again, I would love to see data as to how many women scientists have been caught plagiarizing and conducting research. The people who tend to make headlines, these are the men. No offense meant to the men in the room, but it's the men who tend to make headlines in these things. So I think there is issues around, for example, accountability also. Leaders, men and women, we need to be accountable. Accountability is a big subject. It's not just about managing financial resources, but it's also about how, in a research and innovation environment, we manage everything from, for example, the people to, if you're working with animals, the animals that you work with. If you're working with human participants, how you manage those. So the partners you bring on board in terms of creating the innovation system. Issues around fostering trust, around what people need to be doing. One of the things I think we are impatient about as leaders is mistakes being made in the scientific environment. And yet we realize that for young people, they have to make mistakes before they can actually learn how to pull the strings and get things done. So we need in our environments to foster diversity, and that includes gender. We need to foster new ideas and new experiences, and that diversity of gender, ideas, and experiences is actually what creates thriving research and innovation spaces in our systems. So at the Academy, we have been very deliberate and very intentional. When we design programs like Deltas, Developing Excellence in Leadership Training and Sciences, or programs in climate sciences, or programs in the innovation area where we support a lot of young people, we are very deliberate, and our policies are specifically meant to promote inclusivity and gender parity. We want to seek parity as much as possible, even though the driving force always is merit as the first consideration. But we believe, you can get that, you can achieve all of these things, actually, if you're very deliberate. So one aspect of this is, of course, if we are a funding organization now, nothing compared to the European Union, but we are an African funding organization. We give grants. So one thing we have to do is to be very focused on the kind of policies we are putting in place. So we know there are barriers and challenges to women getting into the sciences, so we have to address those barriers and challenges for women getting into the sciences. So if a woman wants to take time off after they have been given a grant, then the policy needs to be accommodative of that. If they then need to come back after they have had a child and they be reintegrated, the policies need to address that. If they want to move from one lab to another because of all kinds of issues that may come up with supervision or mentorship, then we need to be flexible in how we allow that to happen. And I'm very proud to say that for some of our big programs, we have almost achieved gender parity in terms of the number of grantees and awards we are making. So for us, it's a very simple formula of, what does every young person, man or woman, need? And, it's very simple, three things, good education, good health, and an opportunity to be problem solvers, as we saw in the last section, young people being problem solvers, and that's what we are trying to do to both men and women.
Okay. That sounds very easy when you say that. Tumani Corrah, at AREF, you just started the Excel program together with us at the Robert Bosch Stiftung. This is a leadership program for health-related researchers. And the special point is that you are not training only the individual researcher, but also incorporating the organizations and institutions. So a question, and I think it's a very important one, since also Jean-Pierre and also Tom raised it, how can organizations create an environment where actually young scientists can thrive?
Thank you very much. I just want to take a few steps back to paint a picture of what's happening. If we look at the last 2 decades in Africa, research capacity training focused on technical matters. How do you do clinical trials? How do you collect data for surveillance studies? In other words, the majority of science in Africa were done by doers and not the thinkers. Moving fast forward, in 2015, the Medical Research Council UK sponsored a study to look at the amount of funds that were coming into research capacity building in Africa. And truly, there was a significant amount of sums of money coming into Africa for research capacity development. But unfortunately, or not quite, perhaps not unfortunately, the significant amount of that, almost 80% of that, went towards PhD training. So skills training was not as efficient. What that meant was that the amount of money going to postdoctoral training was quite limited. And this was a discouraging factor to most of our bright young budding scientists who, having completed their PhD, could not find postdoctoral positions, could not find funding, and so abandoned science to go into greener pastures, some of them leaving the continent for good. Now, it was against this backdrop that the Africa Research Excellence Fund was created. Created with the initial focus on enabling talented postdoctoral researchers in sub-Saharan Africa to access the knowledge and the skills essential to proceed to become a leading scientist. The ability to win grants, the ability to win competitive funds, international funds, given that African governments are not as yet contributing enough towards that important position. Moving forward, with funding from the Robert Bosch, and we are very grateful for that, we therefore decided to go even further into leadership development, complementing other leadership programs, such as the one Tom talked about and the ones funded by others. This Excel program provides rising stars access to the same kinds of inspirational, experiential, professional development programs that their counterparts in the North enjoy. And we hope that this will lead them to open access to international funding and career opportunities, which keeps them in Africa to do science for Africa in Africa, impacting on global funds, on global health. The Excel Research and Development Program is rooted in a well-tried program rooted in the UK Research Development Framework. And there are 6 learning themes. These are the effective researcher, the compelling applicant, the influential researcher, the researcher as a manager, the researcher as a leader, and the responsible researcher. With that learning frame in mind, we hope to produce candidates or graduates who have now developed personal development planning skills, who understand research pathways, candidates who know how to enhance research collaboration and networking, candidates who understand effective behavior as a manager, understand the principles of leadership, and hopefully will understand that leadership is leadership and not anything else. These learning teams are founded or based upon organizational, underpinned by development themes. And these are organizational development, individual department, and also the outcomes. The organizational departments, you cannot, in isolation, fully develop an individual without the scientists, the institution taking part. So hence the need to embrace the organization, work with them to ensure that individuals who will be their shining stars in the future have the right compartment, have the right environment to develop their science and progress. These are key for individuals to win grants, place their institutions on the map, and also make sure that science progresses in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Connie, we held a workshop on science leadership already as a pre-event of NEF, and there were assembled the coordinators, project managers of quite some leadership programs as Deltas, for example, STARS, Excel, but also the ASLP. Could you share with us some insights of this day?
Sure, Katrin. We did indeed have a one-day pre-conference workshop on Sunday, and as you mentioned, there were actors from across the landscape of science and society in Africa, and our task was to think about in what ways could we expand the leadership training so that we could create even greater impact of science across the continent. Our task, for that matter, required us to try and think about what are the organizations, the institutions, the categories of people for whom science leadership training might be of value. And the participants were encouraged to really try and picture these individuals in these organizations, think about the pain points that those individuals have, and what elements of a curriculum would address these pain points. And just to allow listeners in the room to picture such a person, I'd like to share my own journey. I would call myself a late bloomer because first I had a bachelor in civil engineering and I began to work in construction. And then by chance, 2 or 3 years after my bachelor, I became a part-time lecturer at a small rural private university in Uganda. And I liked the atmosphere of research and teaching so much that I just wrote to the Institute of Engineers and withdrew my application to become a member and immediately enrolled in a Master of Education because I thought I want to be a teacher, I want to be in education, I want to be in research. And after my master's, I came back and I received a full-time employment at this rural university. And for a couple of years, I taught, I did some research. I was soon appointed dean of the faculty. And I thought, you know, why do I even need a PhD? I'm already being promoted. And the seed to do my PhD was only planted by a chance remark by a cousin of mine who said, every time I speak to you, Connie, you are pondering these questions of how the university system can be improved, how education can be improved. Why not do a PhD? She was not even an academic, but you know, she planted this seed and said, I thought, good idea, I'll do a PhD. After my PhD, I came back to my small rural private university and I spent months wondering what next, what should I do now? And by chance, again, a colleague forwarded a call for the Africa Science Leadership Program, the inaugural session. I applied and I was accepted. And honestly, those 6 days completely transformed my life. What I discovered was that across Africa, all my other colleagues had had mentors, they were in research collaborations, they were publishing. And because I was in this small, rural, private university, I was pretty isolated. And the biggest thing that came from this program is that I developed a deep conviction for how I could apply my science in society. And so deep was this conviction that about a year later, I quit the university, I quit academia, and I set up a small business which develops digital resources to enable early literacy development in ways that match the context of many rural African children. And from then on, in fact, I always joke about the fact that I'm now a recovering academic. But the point of this story is, across Africa, we know that there are a lot of, there's this explosion of private universities. The requirement for higher education is greater and greater, and many of these higher education institutions are run by really overworked, under-resourced, isolated men and women. And many of them do not even have a master's, never mind a PhD. And they're just locked out. They have no mentors. They do not know that there are things like the NEF or the Global Young Academy. And yet they carry the biggest burden of training the next generation of scientists. So in this spirit, at the conference, at the workshop that we had, we asked the participants to really scan the whole spectrum and see where are the underserved populations. And surely enough, the participants came up with really surprising but interesting populations. One group said, what if we started leadership training for girls who, because of social and cultural obstacles, may never join science? Others thought about scientists who end up in industry. What about that mining executive? How does he use science to impact society? What about these people who are on the cusp of becoming part of university management? They need these skills as well. Project managers in funding bodies, they link the agency with the candidates, and they could really benefit from a special kind of leadership training to make sure that their work really impacts science and society. And there was also a group that dealt with the media, because they are the people who are in touch with the masses. And how can a journalist or an editor receive a special kind of research, of leadership training? And so the key insights that came from this one-day workshop included things like, there were a lot of excellent, there are a lot of excellent programs across the continent, but there's a lot of potential for us to collaborate and have even bigger impact. But it was also really clear that there are a lot of underserved and yet critical populations that could benefit from an expanded view of the whole concept of science leadership. And the kind of leadership programs could include standalone programs like the African Science Leadership Program, or integrated in graduate training, regional, country, university-specific. There's a really large scope for where leadership training could be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for reminding us that actually it's not the researcher, but we really have to think about whom we actually want to address with our programs, with the programs, what's the personal context, but also what are the local conditions and challenges one is trapped in, and maybe think also about the younger universities, for example, where there are a lot of lecturers not holding a PhD even, but having leadership tasks anyway. Thank you. Howard, Alper, may I ask you, you have an overseas perspective, and when we are going through the world, so at MIT, Harvard, Cambridge, Munich, probably also Ottawa, we can find excellent young scientists from Africa. So do you actually think these diaspora scientists can help to develop also the African science in Africa? Because I perceive that actually they want to.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Connie. I remember Connie at the African Science Leadership Program several years ago, telling her story as of that point. And it was inspiring then and was inspiring just now. Thank you, really. Professor Bourguignon covered more than half of the material I have on my notes, which is great. Because what I think I would like to do is give you, not as a policy person, but as a scientist, rather different perspective, utilizing some of the same principles in terms of leadership. But first I want to address the question directed to me. I will say this. In my opinion, it would be highly beneficial for governments to consider creating a Rediscover Africa research chairs program to bring the diaspora back, at least some of them. After all, in my own country in 2000, that's 18 years ago, was the Canada Research Chairs program, because we had significant brain drain for the same reasons as here and for different reasons. And that program has been incredibly successful. So that would be one way to actually bring people back. But there are other ways where they provide short-term to medium-term added value to Africa. And by their commitment to this continent, they can make a difference. For example, they can give lectures for several weeks to several months or longer. More valuable than that, that is valuable, is having students that they co-supervise or supervise themselves and spend time in one or another country in Africa. Exchange students, say a professor of African heritage at my university actually does exchange programs with two countries, scientists in two countries in Africa, to expand that. So there are different vehicles that one can consider. Whatever they do, what I think is very important is to have as underpinning in their approach commitment to excellence and integrity globally, not only Africa and Canada. That is essential. That sets the tone and direction for the people who work with these individuals, as students, as postdocs, and so on. So I'll just make a couple of comments. First, and acknowledging Professor Bourguignon's excellent point on you have to consider the areas that you're looking at. It's not one shoe fits all, so to speak. We need to take that in account, but be it as it may, there are a number of key cross-cutting points to make. Young scientists and older need to be excellent listeners to their students, to their postdocs, to their colleagues. Too many don't listen very well and impose their views without considering what their co-workers are doing. Second, be flexible and receptive to new ideas. I looked it up, 232 graduate students and postdocs in my career, some of whom are leaders in the world now, many. And many of whom came to me with their ideas on what research they wish to do. I had my own ideas, and I proposed it to them. Many liked those ideas and chose one, but some didn't like any, and even if they did, they thought theirs was better. So be very open to ideas from the people who are going to work with you in Africa and elsewhere. The main role of a research supervisor, in my opinion, is to nurture creativity such that they are able to perform at a level beyond which they thought was possible. Last, never be complacent. Never relax and Relax, yes, on the weekend and so on. But in your role, do not be complacent or comfortable. Why? Because you then may be satisfied with the status quo. John Manley, the former Minister of Industry in Canada, who's also Minister of Foreign Affairs, Finance, Minister of almost everything, when the University of Ottawa made major transformation for an institution, the first university in the country to do it, by setting priorities, directions, making choices. He said, if you're complacent, then you're going to think that good is good enough. But good may not be good enough and could be the enemy of the best. You always want to aspire to be at the front of the line. That is really important to developing scientific leadership, and I give leadership presentations to politicians, bureaucrats, and so on. That applies there equally. So I just mentioned those few, and I want to mention one last thing on women. In my research group, when I travel, which is too often over the years, I only put a woman in charge of my group, take care of my group. Why? To give them the responsibility to be taking care of the group, dealing with various issues, and so on. And as a little vignette, I'll tell you the first person that I asked to do it, Karen Totland from University of Victoria, where she did her undergraduate. When I asked her to do it, she said, no, I can't do it. That is just like I'm running for the head of state, the initiative, where I meet with women and they'll tell me, no, I'm not ready yet to be nominated for this award or prize. Yes, you are. Have confidence and so on. And Karen had little confidence. So I said, okay, go away over the weekend and come back and we'll discuss it. She did. Karen was a very shy individual, very articulate, but very shy. On Monday, she agreed to do it. She did it during her PhD career, maybe 8 or 10 or 12 times. It transformed her as an individual, she'll tell you. And consequently, Karen became number 2 in one of the top fragrant and flavor companies in the world after going up the ladder in short order.
Thank you very much. Now let's open up for some questions from the audience. Are there some questions on the panel? And let us please know who you are, your affiliation, and maybe to whom you want to direct your question. There's one over there.
Merci. Je peux parler en français? Can I speak French? Okay. Okay. Je suis Madame Sarr Rufina Dabo du Sénégal. Je suis présidente d'une association de femmes pour la promotion des sciences et de la technologie depuis 1999. Nous l'avons créée ensemble avec des collègues et j'ai passé la main il y a quelques années à une doyenne. Je suis très satisfaite de cette session parce qu'elle parle de leadership et les interventions m'ont beaucoup touchée. Tout simplement parce que le leadership dans nos pays africains touche aux relations entre les hommes et les femmes. J'ai une question à poser. La première question, j'ai des questions à poser. La première, est-ce que leadership veut dire compétition entre hommes et femmes ou compétition entre générations jeunes et générations plus anciennes ou entre jeunes et adultes? L'autre question, est-ce qu'on peut intégrer la valorisation des acquis de l'expérience quand on parle de leadership? il faut aussi, ce que j'ai comme remarque à faire, c'est que le système francophone est différent du système anglophone. Le système francophone est beaucoup plus fermé. C'est très difficile à percer quand on est chercheur. Personnellement, j'ai été dans un cas similaire. J'ai eu des difficultés, je ne vais pas raconter parce que ce n'est pas le lieu ni le moment de le faire. Mais ça a été très difficile. Et je pense que j'ai pu réussir parce que j'ai eu des hommes qui étaient là pour m'épauler. En particulier, je termine par ça, excusez-moi, en particulier mon directeur de mémoire. Et j'ai pu avoir un master en sciences de l'éducation. Oui? J'ai fini.
Okay. Thank you very much. So these are 2 questions. Are there other questions? We will collect 1 or 2 more and then answer them. Cool. So there's one over there and one over there. And please, short questions.
Aidan Gilligan from Brussels, from SciComm, Making Sense of Science. Just a very general question to the panel. In terms of the future of being a scientist or a researcher, do you think that we have presently, certainly in Europe and perhaps in Africa, overkill in young researchers supposed to know everything about ethics, ethics about their grant application, the use of the science and so on? Is there a risk that future researchers have to be a little bit scientist, philosopher, medical doctor, and maybe legal eagle as well? Just a general question.
Thank you very much. So last question. So, okay, there, let's take this one over.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the presentations. As I listen to this panel and to the innovators, there's something that kept, turning on my mind. And the question really is, yes, leadership in the scientific domain, in research, in innovation, but where do we really begin to bring together that nexus of the researchers, government, and the private sector? Because leadership that would create change may not necessarily come from the leaders within the scientific domain. They may have all the good findings, they have all the good reasons, but how can they really influence change? I really feel there is something that is missing, that we need the leaders in the different quarters, but they must be able to talk to each other to impact change, and that is what Africa lacks. We cannot change because the researchers are doing their own, and the innovators that we heard from are struggling to get the grants, are struggling to scale up. So how do we do the scaling up? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have the question about, is leadership competition, and does it have to be like this? We have the overkill of ethics question and the intersectoral leadership, I would call it. So is there someone who wants to answer? Please, Mr.
No, thanks. Let me talk to the issues around leadership in terms of, from a colleague from Senegal. Where I'm sitting, I think the issue of leadership shouldn't be competition. I mean, good leaders don't compete. Good leaders, it's that one that is able to take others with them. A leader produces other leaders. So the issue, it shouldn't even be, but because of, and I understand the context that she is talking about, being in the continent, being women, for example, in the continent, at times when you are in leadership, you would be questioned, and therefore you have to constantly assert yourself. You have constantly affirm your leadership role rather than men. But most of the time, I think the issue for me is that how do we make sure that those who have made it carry others along? How do we create support structures such that if there are less women in science field, how do we bring them? But it starts again with younger ones. It starts with us in home, how we socialize our children, how we teach them the responsibilities. For example, where you separate to say the girls will have to remain in the house, wash dishes, cleaning, while the boy is playing. If you can start with making sure that they understand that it's a dual responsibility, everybody else. As they grow into society, they will be able to respect one another. So leadership is about us, all of us having the responsibility. It's not even about being in front. At times you cannot be even elected, but become a leader within, in the manner that you provide support to others, provide support to those who are coming, both as young or old. And you might even have a younger person becoming a leader. So it's not a differentiation. It's not about differences in race, in gender, in age, but it's about the responsibility and how you define it. And just one interesting thing that I think the colleague picked up, any new young scientist who would not open their mind to the society and the world will not survive. If, as a scientist, you'd want to focus only on research and studying without understanding the broader context of society, without understanding that we live in a complex society and therefore respond, I don't think you'll survive. I mean, typical example, you'd have somebody who passes with a PhD who goes well, but if they lack, for example, some simple thing, discipline, understanding the environment they behave. I mean, one time we had a session where I had told my team, we had one young lady who had done one that we had bringing, it was a science festival for young children at high school. We brought her in to come and do motivation. She was late. I was quite upset because it's setting a wrong example, and I'm saying, being qualified, knowing, finding innovation ways, but you do not link that with interdisciplinary other issues around values in society, around understanding the context of what you are operating. And that's correct. You would have to understand the basic understanding of law, because if you have to register your IP after finding an innovative thing, you need to understand the basic issues. So opening up your mind and not closing yourself, it's quite critical today for scientists going forward. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Tumani.
I mean, a leader is neutral. A leader has no gender. And a leader is someone who's comfortable sharing two things, sharing power and sharing leadership. It doesn't have to be male or female. Leadership, or a leader, should focus on building talent, developing leadership, and identifying ways to develop others to become leaders. If we take that as a holistic approach, then there is no issue of gender balance here.
Thank you. Connie?
Yes, if I may just say a little bit about the competition aspect. I think over time we've understood that competition with the many diverse many diverse challenges that Africa faces, it's not possible to really solve them by yourself. So collaboration or collaborative leadership is it's a much better model. So I would like to think that the next generation of leaders are going to appreciate this. And just quickly on this nexus between scientists, government, and private sector, this is really critical. And unfortunately, many people think of science leadership as becoming top in your field, that's part of it, you know. But simply getting hundreds of publications, but never having any impact in society is also not leadership, in my opinion. And unfortunately, though, scientists do not have these skills to talk to talk to policy makers, and even this orientation to talk to them at all. They're just in the university doing what they're doing. And I must raise one really good program that takes place in Nairobi. It's run by the Partnership for African Research and Governance, something like that. And they train researchers in policy-engaged research. And they really give you ways in which to communicate with media, with policymakers, and this orientation is really missing and is absolutely critical.
So thank you very much. Unfortunately, I have to close the session at this point. I know there are many questions left. Thank you very much for sharing your insights with us. Thank you very much for the questions. And now have an inspiring evening, and never forget to support the next generation. Thank you.
Thank you, moderator and panelists. You may please take a seat. Thank you. As we come to a close, I would like to announce a few reminders. for the scientific theater play inspired by Richard Feynman, titled The Principle of Uncertainty. It's taking place now at 6:15 in MH3 room. Also, the AIMS Industry Initiative Affiliation Program is taking place in AD11 Songa. Final announcements: tomorrow, third day of the global gathering, we will start a little bit earlier. We will start at 8:30 a.m. instead of 9 a.m. So we will recommend